There is a moment, buried somewhere in the lore of Westeros, where two completely different men exist inside the same body. One of them is a colossus, a force of nature wearing antlered steel. A man who swings a warhammer the way some people breathe, naturally, terrifyingly, without thinking. A man who splits armies, hunts crowns the way lesser lords hunt deer, and once stood knee-deep in a cold river in 283 AC and ended the Targaryen dynasty with a single thunderous blow. That man was called the Demon of the Trident, and for one shining, violent, world-altering moment, he was the most dangerous human being in the known world. The other man is someone you meet on the first page of a Game of Thrones and in the very first episode of the television series. He arrives at Winterfell in a column of silk and gold. It's sweating through his doublet, his face the color of a beet that has been left too long in the sun, his enormous gut straining against cloth that was very clearly tailored for someone who had not spent 17 years eating the treasury of an entire kingdom. He tells crude jokes, he pinches serving girls, he gets blind drunk at feasts and bellows old war stories at men who have heard them 100 times already. He sits on the most uncomfortable chair in the world and hates every single second of it. His hand of the king does the actual governing. His wife schemes against him in broad daylight. His children, as it will turn out, are not even his. And he will be dead by the 7th episode of the first season, gutted by a boar in the woods while too drunk to defend himself. That man was called the Fat King, and he was, by almost every measure, a disaster. The question that sits at the center of everything, the question that makes Robert Baratheon one of the most tragically fascinating characters in fantasy literature, is how the same man can be both of those things. How do you go from demon to Fat King? How does the greatest warrior in the realm become the worst thing he could possibly imagine? How does a man conquer a continent and then spend 15 years slowly eating and drinking himself to death? And what does it say about poor, grief, and the stories we tell ourselves that the man who broke Rhaegar Targaryen's chest, open with a hammer, ended up being broken, just more slowly, by a throne? That is exactly what we are going to explore tonight. From the volcanic cliffs of Storm's End to the corpse-strewn shallows of the Ruby Ford, from the silent crypts of Winterfell to the suffocating corridors of the Red Keep, we are going to trace every chapter of Robert Baratheon's life. The losses that made him, the war that defined him, the victory that ruined him, and the slow, sad unraveling that followed. This is the complete story of how the Demon of the Trident became the Fat King. And it starts, as most great tragedies do, with a boy standing on a castle wall, watching the sea take everything he had ever trusted. Before we go any further, let me explain why this story deserves the deep treatment. There is a tendency, understandable but ultimately a mistake, to read Robert Baratheon as scenery, as the reason the first season of Game of Thrones happens, as the mechanism by which Eddard Stark ends up in King's Landing, and therefore as the cause of everything terrible that follows. But reducing Robert to narrative scaffolding misses what George R. Martin was actually doing with the character, and it misses one of the more quietly devastating portraits in the whole story. Robert Baratheon is not background, he is a lens. Everything about the world of Westeros, its values, its contradictions, its brutal arithmetic of what it rewards and what it destroys, is visible through the prism of his life. He is what that world produces when it is working as designed. He is the apex predator of a culture that prizes physical power, personal loyalty, and violent directness. And then he is what that same culture does to its apex predator when the fighting stops. He is also, and this is perhaps the least discussed aspect of his story, a genuinely sympathetic figure once you know the full context. Not sympathetic in the sense of blameless. He made terrible choices and caused real damage and hurt real people. But sympathetic in the sense that his destruction was not simply a product of moral failure. It was the product of grief that was never allowed to breathe, of a role that was catastrophically mismatched to his nature, of a world that had no tools for helping men understand themselves beyond the hammer and the hunt. He was not given what he needed to be anything other than what he became, and that is worth sitting with. We will not flinch from the hard parts, the violence in his marriage, the children he ignored, the governance he abdicated, the world he left on fire behind him. But we will also not pretend that the hard parts are the whole story. They are not. Yet the whole story is bigger and stranger and more human than any simple verdict allows. And it starts, as most great tragedies do, with a boy standing on a castle wall, watching the sea take everything he had ever trusted. Section 2. The world that made him. Westeros before the rebellion. Before we can understand Robert Baratheon as a person, we need to understand the world he was born into. Not just its geography or its political arrangements, but its feeling, the texture of what it meant to be alive in Westeros in the second half of the century, before the events of Game of Thrones. Because that world had a very specific quality to it, a quality that shaped every single person who grew up inside it, and that makes Robert's trajectory make sense in a way it otherwise would not. In Westeros, in the 260s and 270s years after Aegon's conquest, was on the surface a prosperous and stable place. The Targaryens had held the Iron Throne for nearly 300 years by that point. The great houses had all bent the knee generations before. The wars of Aegon's succession, the Dance of Dragons, the Blackfyre rebellions, were old history, settled and mostly forgotten by all but the Maesters and the obsessively studious. For the average Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, the Targaryen dynasty was not a wound or a resentment. It was simply the way things were, the natural order of the world. The dragon sat the throne. You paid your taxes, sent your sons to war when called upon, and lived your life. But the surface of a thing and the truth of it are rarely identical. And the truth of Westeros in those years was that something was rotting quietly at its center. The rot had a name, Aerys Targaryen, the second of his name, also known, with the kind of brutal simplicity that only history can manage, as the Mad King. Aerys had not always been mad. This is important, and it is something that even people who know the story well sometimes forget. The young Aerys had been promising. He was handsome, charming, and possessed of a genuine warmth. He had a gift for making people feel seen and valued. He was close friends in his youth with Tywin Lannister, the brilliant and ambitious son of a great house, and with Steffon Baratheon, the Lord of Storm's End. These were not friendships of convenience, but of genuine affection. Steffon, who would become Robert's father, grew up alongside the future Mad King, is trained with him, confided in him. They were, in the language of the time, as close as brothers. The madness did not arrive all at once. It crept in over years, encouraged by isolation, paranoia, and a sequence of traumatic events that would test any mind. The Defiance of Duskendale, a botched kidnapping plot in 277 AC, during which Aerys was held hostage for months by a rebellious lord, fractured something inside him that could not be repaired. The Aerys who emerged from that captivity was different, suspicious where he had been trusting, volatile where he had been warm. The old certainties had been burned away, and in their place grew a terrible, escalating hunger for fire. He began to burn people alive for real and imagined slights. He neglected governance for obsession. He kept his wife as a prisoner and his kingdom as a hostage. His son Rhaegar, the crown prince, began quietly seeking ways to address the situation, ways that would eventually involve the lords of Westeros in a solution to a problem that grew more dangerous by the year. This is the atmosphere in which Robert Baratheon came of age. Not quite war, not quite peace. A kingdom held together by old precedent and the hope that the king would become rational again, even as every passing year made that hope less credible. For the great lords and their children, and Robert was absolutely one of those children, there was a constant low hum of anxiety beneath the ordinary business of tilts and feasts and alliances. The sense that the world could crack open if the wrong thing happened. It would. But not yet. Yet the Seven Kingdoms that Robert inhabited were also a world of extraordinary physical beauty and brutal social reality. The castles were magnificent. The tournaments were genuinely spectacular, and the bonds forged between young lords fostered together at great houses could be among the most important relationships of their lives. But it was also a world in which a man's worth was measured almost entirely by his capacity for violence, where the highest expression of masculine virtue was what happened when you pointed a weapon at another person, where the greatest hero was the man who made the pile of bodies the tallest. These were not subtle values. They were taught early, reinforced constantly, and rewarded without nuance. Robert Baratheon absorbed all of this completely. He was, in many ways, the perfect product of his world. But he was strong, brave, generous, loud, and absolutely without fear. He was also, unfortunately, almost entirely unsuited to anything that required patience, introspection, or the kind of governance that involves sitting in a small council chamber, listening to men talk about grain prices. But we will come to that. The world made him, in both senses. It made him magnificent, and it made him exactly wrong for what was about to be asked of him. The house he was born into, House Baratheon of Storm's End, was itself a fascinating reflection of this world. The Baratheons were relatively young as great houses go, only about 300 years old at the time of Robert's birth. Founded by Orys Baratheon, Aegon the Conqueror's most trusted commander and reputed bastard half-brother. But in those 3 centuries they had made themselves indispensable, building their reputation entirely on the simplest and most primal of aristocratic currencies, the willingness to fight and the capacity to win. Storm's End itself, that massive, perfectly round castle sitting on the cliffs above Shipbreaker Bay, with walls 40 feet thick and a history of surviving every storm the world had thrown at it, was the physical expression of the Baratheon character, built for endurance, built to take punishment and remain standing, beautiful in its brutal way, but a fortress before it was anything else. The Baratheon words were, "Ours is the fury." Not a promise of gentleness, not an aspiration toward wisdom, just a flat declaration. The fury belongs to us. We carry it. That is who we are. Robert Baratheon grew up breathing that air. And when the time came, he proved that the words were not merely a motto. There is also a cultural context worth understanding here that shapes how Robert moved through his world. The society of Westeros in this era was not simply violent in the way that all societies with swords tend toward violence. It had a specific ideology around masculine virtue that treated physical dominance as the highest expression of worth. Tournaments were not mere entertainment. They were performances of the social order. The jousting list was a kind of operating theater, in which the class hierarchy was reproduced and confirmed, or occasionally overturned. Great knights became legends not because of their administration or their poetry, but because of what they could do to other men in a narrow strip of ground at speed. Yes, the culture had invested enormous weight in the question of who was the hardest, fastest, most dangerous person resin. Robert thrived in this culture the way certain organisms thrive in specific environments, not by adapting to it, but by being perfectly constituted for it by nature. He did not have to work to be magnetic and physical and dominant. He simply was those things, instinctively, without effort. When he picked up a weapon, it was the extension of something that was already there in him, something that had been waiting for an instrument. When he rode onto a tourney field, people watched because something in the pre-rational animal part of the brain recognized what it was looking at and found it compelling. This is not, it should be said, a morally unambiguous thing to be. Yet the same cultural values that celebrated Robert also produced immense suffering. In the wars that the great lords could start with a grudge and a few thousand men. In the casual disposal of the lives of people who were not born into the right families. The small folk of Westeros, the farmers and fishermen and craftspeople who make up the overwhelming majority of its population, had essentially no protection against the whims of their lords, and the lords had essentially no accountability for how they treated them. Robert never truly grappled with this. It was invisible to him, in the way that the water is invisible to the fish. He was, in the deepest sense, a product of the aristocratic warrior culture of his world, gifted by it, limited by it, and ultimately destroyed by the same forces that had made him great. At Section 3, The Boy Before the Storm, Robert's youth and early life. Robert Baratheon was born in the year 262, AC at Storm's End, the eldest son of Lord Steffon Baratheon and Lady Cassana Estermont. He came into the world exactly as you might imagine a Baratheon entering it, large, loud, and healthy. His brother Stannis followed 2 years later, and his youngest brother Renly was not born until 277 AC, by which point Robert and Stannis were already teenagers. The gap between the brothers is significant, not just in years, but in temperament and the shape of their lives. Robert and Stannis were close in age, but couldn't have been more different in personality. Robert was effusive, physical, magnetic, the kind of boy who fills whatever room he enters simply by being in it. Stannis was dour, principled, rigidly honest, and privately furious at almost everything. They would spend most of their lives managing a complicated relationship that never quite became affection, but never stopped being necessary. Lord Stefan Baratheon was, by all accounts, a genuinely fine man. He was close to King Aerys. They had grown up together, had served as pages and squires in the same halls, had the kind of friendship that survives decades and distance. Stefan was capable, sensible, and well-regarded across the realm. He loved his sons. He took young Robert and Stannis to court at the Red Keep when they were small, and the two boys were awed by what they saw, or rather, by who they thought they saw. They believed they were watching the king hold court from the Iron Throne, and they were deeply impressed by the dignity and power of it. And only years later did Stefan reveal the truth. Aerys had cut himself on the throne that day and retreated to his chambers, and what the boys had actually witnessed was Lord Tywin Lannister, the Hand of the King, conducting affairs in the king's absence. It was not the last time in Robert's life that something would turn out to be other than what it appeared. At some point in his childhood, the sources are not precise on exactly when, Robert was sent to the Eyrie to be fostered as a ward of Lord Jon Arryn, the head of House Arryn and the Lord of the Vale of Arryn. This was a common and important practice among the great lords of Westeros. You sent your children to be raised in another great house, partly for the education, partly to forge political alliances, and partly because a foster son was also a subtle kind of hostage, a guarantee of loyalty between houses. Jon Arryn was one of the most respected men in the Seven Kingdoms, known for his honor, his wisdom, and a kind of old-fashioned steadiness that was increasingly rare in a realm where the king was growing more erratic by the year. It was at the Eyrie that Robert Baratheon met Eddard Stark. This friendship, this deep, defining, almost fraternal friendship between Robert Baratheon and Eddard Stark, is arguably the emotional spine of everything that follows in Game of Thrones. Not the politics, not the war, not the dragons or the scheming or the wildfire. The spine is two boys in a castle above the clouds, becoming brothers in everything but blood, and what happens to both of them as a result. Jon Arryn had no children of his own at the time. He raised Robert and Eddard with a father's spur, and the two young lords responded by forming a bond that would last and shape events for the rest of their lives. They were, in many ways, opposites. Robert was boisterous where Ned was reserved. Robert was reckless where Ned was deliberate. Robert laughed easily and loudly. Ned considered things slowly and spoke with precision. But opposites often fit together in friendship in ways that like-minded people do not, because they supply each other with what is missing. Ned gave Robert a conscience, a steady point of reference. Robert gave Ned something to be loyal to, someone whose warmth could offset the North's long silences. They became, Robert would later say, closer than brothers. This is not a small thing. It is in some ways the most important friendship in the political history of Westeros during this era. Everything that follows, the rebellion, the decision to start the war, the choice to press on after the first defeats, the victory at the Trident, the aftermath, turns on this relationship. Without it, the rebellion probably does not happen. And without the rebellion, the entire story of Game of Thrones does not exist in anything like the form we know. While Robert was growing up at the Eyrie, he was also growing into his body in a way that genuinely alarmed people who saw it for the first time. By the time he was a young man, Robert Baratheon was 6.5 feet tall, broad as a barn door, and muscled in a way that Ned would later describe as something out of a young girl's fantasy of what a man should look like. Yes, he had the classic Baratheon appearance: thick black hair, intense blue eyes, a jaw like a cliff face, and the physical presence to match. He was not merely large. He generated a field of energy around himself. People noticed him when he entered a room. Soldiers loved him at first sight. Women were drawn to him in ways that would become both his greatest pleasure and one of his most complicated ongoing problems. He was also, from very young, a genuinely extraordinary fighter. His weapon of choice was a warhammer, a massive spiked iron thing that Donal Noye, the blacksmith at Storm's End, crafted for him, and that Eddard Stark famously could barely lift. Robert did not merely carry this weapon. He wielded it the way a master musician plays an instrument, with total ease, perfect timing, and a kind of primal joy that was almost frightening to watch. He preferred tournaments that involved direct physical contact over jousts. He loved melees. He loved the feel and the weight, and the pure, honest simplicity of two men testing strength against strength. No political maneuvering, No coded language, no alliances or betrayals. Just the hammer and the other person, and whatever happened next. The choice of weapon is revealing when you think about it. A sword is a tool with finesse. It requires skill and technique, and the ability to read another person's movements and find the gaps between them. A great sword fighter is often as much a strategist as a brute. A warhammer, by contrast, is not a subtle instrument. It does not seek the gap. It creates the gap. It breaks things. It ends arguments by a different mechanism than a sword does. Not by outmaneuvering the opponent, but by simply overwhelming whatever they put between themselves and the blow. Robert's choice of hammer was not accidental. It was a declaration of philosophy. In battle, he wore a great antlered helmet that made him look, as the chronicles would later describe it, like a horned god of war. This was not accidental. Robert understood, intuitively, the theater of combat. He understood that an army needed something to follow, a figure that seemed larger than the ordinary run of men. He provided that, not through calculation, but through sheer natural force of personality. When Robert Baratheon rode into battle, men followed him not because they had been ordered to, but because something in the primitive, the pre-rational part of their minds said, that is where the victory is. He also fought with what could only be called a kind of joy. This is something the histories note, and the fictional accounts confirm. Robert Baratheon was not a grim warrior. He was not the kind of man who killed with a cold efficiency and moved on. He was exhilarated by combat. The songs of swords, as the novels phrase it, was music he loved. He was at his most alive in the middle of a fight, surrounded by the noise and the danger and the physical reality of it. The world had never been as clear or as real to him as it was in those moments, and he chased that feeling his entire life, through hunting and drinking and physical excess, because nothing else came close. The sorrow of Robert Baratheon, one of many sorrows, is that all of these remarkable qualities were perfectly calibrated for war and almost entirely useless for peace. The same force that made armies love him made councils uncomfortable. The same directness that inspired soldiers made diplomacy impossible. The same absolute confidence in physical resolution made him unable to navigate situations where the problem could not be solved by hitting it. He was built exquisitely for the very specific purpose of overthrowing a dynasty, and once that was done, he had nowhere to put himself. He was knighted during his time at the Eyrie, earning his spurs as was appropriate for a young lord of his station. He was once defeated in a tourney at Storm's End by Sir Barristan Selmy, the great knight who would later serve on Robert's own Kingsguard. A defeat that Robert apparently accepted with the good grace of someone who genuinely respected the man who beat him. Barristan Selmy was already legendary by this point, and being beaten by a legend is different from being beaten by a peer. Robert understood the distinction. But before we get to the tragedy, we need to talk about what happened when Robert was 16 years old. Standing on the walls of Storm's End with his younger brother Stannis, watching the sea. His parents had been on a voyage. Lord Steffon, ever loyal to King Aerys despite the king's growing instability, had been sent on a mission to the free cities of Essos to find a suitable bride for Prince Rhaegar among the noble families there. It was the kind of mission that speaks to the trust the king still placed in his old friend. Steffon had gone, had failed to find anyone suitable, and had sent word ahead saying he was returning, and that he had found a fool so talented that even dour Stannis might learn to laugh. The ship never made it home. Within sight of Storm's End, within sight of Robert and Stannis standing on the parapets watching for their parents' return, the Windproud was caught in a storm on Shipbreaker Bay and broken on the rocks. The two brothers watched it happen. They stood there and watched the ship go apart, and they watched the sea take everyone aboard, and there was absolutely nothing either of them could do. And Robert became Lord of Storm's End at 16. Stannis would later say that this was the moment he stopped believing in gods, that no gods worthy of worship would have drowned two good people within sight of their children. Robert did not speak about it in the same way. What he did instead was what Robert Baratheon always did when grief became unbearable. He moved. He took up his hammer. He carried the title of Lord and the weight of the Stormlands, and he drove himself forward because stopping was the thing that would have killed him. If you want to understand why Robert Baratheon drank himself to death over a ghost named Lyanna, it helps to remember that he already knew how to bury grief in motion. He had practice. The pattern started here, at 16, on those stone walls above Shipbreaker Bay. Section 4, The Spark That Lit the Realm, Lyanna, Rhaegar, and the Road to War. Now we arrive at the part of the story that everyone knows, or thinks they know, the love story, if you can call it that, and the war that followed from it. Except that the real version of this story is considerably stranger and considerably more tragic than the simplified version. And it's worth taking the time to understand all of it. Because the real story of what happened between Lyanna Stark, Rhaegar Targaryen, and Robert Baratheon is, in the end, the story of almost everything that happens in Game of Thrones. At some point after becoming Lord of Storm's End, the exact timing is not entirely clear, Robert Baratheon was betrothed to Lyanna Stark, the only daughter of Lord Rickard Stark of Winterfell. The match made obvious political sense. As the Baratheons and Starks were both great houses, both lords paramount of their respective regions. A marriage between them would forge an alliance between the North and the Stormlands, and the addition of the Vale, where Robert and Ned had both been fostered, would create a formidable block of northern and eastern power. The betrothal also served the deeper friendship between Robert and Ned. Marrying Lyanna would make Robert Ned's brother-in-law, completing a bond that was already, practically speaking, fraternal. Robert loved Lyanna. Of this there is no real doubt. He was consumed by her. In the years after her death, he would carry her memory the way a wound carries infection, unable to let it go, unable to stop probing it. He would visit her tomb at Winterfell and stand there in silence. He would mutter her name in drunken stupors. He would admit to Ned's face that he had never loved Cersei because of Lyanna, that Lyanna was the one person he had truly wanted. And by the time we see all of this, years of suffering have made it rawer and more real than anything else in his emotional life. But here is the complicated truth that sits at the center of it all. Lyanna did not love Robert, not in the same way, not in the all-consuming, life-defining way that he loved her. She knew about his bastard daughter Maya Stone, a child he had fathered on a girl in the Vale during the very time of his betrothal to Lyanna. And she told her brother Ned, with a practicality that is quietly heartbreaking, that Robert would never keep to one bed. She was not naive or vindictive about it. She simply saw clearly what Robert was, and what their marriage would likely be. His love for her was real, but she knew that it would not make him faithful, and she did not intend to spend her life pretending otherwise. Lyanna Stark was, by all accounts, remarkable. She was described as wild and boyish, strong-willed and fiercely independent. The kind of woman who would have carried a sword if her father had permitted it. She loved horses and rode like a centaur. She was beautiful, Lord Rickard's famous wild beauty. But what made her genuinely striking was the force of her personality. She was not content to be a prize or a political arrangement. She had opinions, desires, and a kind of fearless directness that must have been both thrilling and alarming to everyone around her. Then came the tourney at Harrenhal in 281 AC. This tournament, sponsored by Lord Walter Went, but widely suspected to have been organized at Prince Rhaegar's instigation for purposes that remain debated, was one of the great social events of the era. The entire court gathered there. King Aerys himself made one of his increasingly rare public appearances. Every major house was represented, and it was at Harrenhal that the series of events that would topple the Targaryen dynasty was set in motion. The tournament was remarkable in itself, independent of its later consequences. It was enormous, expensive, and attended by virtually every significant figure in the realm: the Tyrells, the Martells, the Lannisters, the Starks, the Arryns, the Baratheons. Robert was there, his betrothal to Lyanna recently arranged, presumably feeling some satisfaction at the prospect of the future taking shape around him. He was young and strong and betrothed to a beautiful northern girl who was the sister of his best friend. The world was arranging itself as it should. He also had an early encounter at Harrenhal that speaks to a certain pattern in his nature. During the feast, Robert encountered a knight named Richard Lonmouth and engaged him in a drinking game. Robert won, and won convincingly, with the kind of gleeful competitiveness that characterized everything he did. The story is told admiringly by those who recount it. He was just as Robert in a drinking contest as he was on a battlefield, throwing himself in completely and coming out ahead. The story is also, in retrospect, slightly cautionary about what relentless victory at drinking games might eventually produce. Lyanna was at Harrenhal with her brothers. She saved Howland Reed, a small and reedy man from the Neck who would become Eddard Stark's most loyal bannerman, from a group of squires who were tormenting him for sport, bringing him back to the Stark tent, and treating him with a kindness that spoke to her genuine character beneath all the wildness. This is one of the few direct glimpses we have of Lyanna in action, and it is not accidental that what it shows is a woman who noticed someone being hurt and did something about it. Rhaegar Targaryen won the tournament. The Crown Prince was a man of extraordinary personal qualities, a gifted musician, a serious scholar, widely regarded as noble and kind and thoughtful in ways that his father entirely was not. He was also one of the finest knights in the realm. He won the tournament, which meant it was his right to choose a queen of love and beauty, a ceremonial honor, but a public one. The expected choice, the correct and unambiguous choice, was his wife, Princess Elia Martell of Dorne. Rhaegar rode past Elia. He rode past every other woman present, and he placed the crown of blue winter roses in the lap of Lyanna Stark, Robert Baratheon's betrothed. The silence that followed was described as something you could almost touch. Nobody quite knew how to respond to what had just happened. Brandon Stark, Lyanna's older brother and a man of very limited patience, had to be physically restrained from confronting Rhaegar on the spot. Robert's reaction is historically ambiguous. Some accounts say he laughed and said Rhaegar was merely paying Lyanna her due. Others say he was furious. What is certain is that Rhaegar crowning Lyanna as his queen of love and beauty, with his wife sitting right there, this was the kind of moment that people discussed for years afterward. It was also, we now know, not merely a gesture of admiration. It was the beginning of something. What exactly happened next between Rhaegar and Lyanna is one of the great questions of the whole narrative. They could not have had many private meetings. The logistics of court life and the surveillance that comes with being a crown prince do not allow for easy secret romance. But something happened. Something was communicated, perhaps through letters, perhaps through intermediaries, perhaps in the stolen moments available at a great tournament where thousands of people were present, and therefore the sheer number of faces made individual movements harder to track. Something passed between them that was profound enough to lead to what came next. Rhaegar and Lyanna subsequently, and secretly, ran away together. This is where the story fractures into competing truths. For most of the characters in Game of Thrones, including Robert himself, the received version is simple. Rhaegar kidnapped Lyanna. He abducted the betrothed of a great lord and violated her. He stole her, kept her against her will, and Robert's subsequent war was a rescue mission. Robert believed this completely, with every cell in his body. He never questioned it. He never had reason to. And the belief that Rhaegar had raped and stolen his Lyanna was the furnace inside which his fury for the Targaryens burned for the rest of his life. The truth, as the show eventually reveals through Bran Stark's visions, was different. Lyanna and Rhaegar had fallen in love. They had eloped to Dorne, to a place called the Tower of Joy, and they had been secretly and officially married. Lyanna had gone willingly, and she died there, not as a victim of abduction, but as a new mother, delivering a baby boy, Rhaegar's son and her son, who would eventually be raised as Jon Snow, and whose true name was Aegon Targaryen. The realm never knew any of this. Eddard Stark knew, because he found his dying sister in that tower after the war, and he chose, for reasons of protection, grief, and loyalty, to keep the secret. Robert would have killed the boy without a moment's hesitation. The hatred he held for all things Targaryen after the war was absolute and volcanic. And so Jon Snow grew up as a bastard in the north, carrying a truth that would reshape everything, while Robert Baratheon spent 15 years mourning a ghost who had never truly been his. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Back in 282 AC, none of this was known. What was known was that Lyanna was gone, and then things got worse very fast. Brandon Stark, Lyanna's eldest brother, who had been on his way to Riverrun to marry Catelyn Tully, heard that Rhaegar had taken his sister. He rode to King's Landing instead, arriving in the city with a group of companions and demanding that Prince Rhaegar answer for what he had done. In normal circumstances, this might have been managed through the usual channels of noble dispute, a formal complaint, a hearing before the king, some resolution short of catastrophe. Aerys Targaryen was not operating in normal circumstances anymore. Brandon was arrested on the spot and charged with threatening the life of the Crown Prince. Then Lord Rickard Stark, Brandon's father, Lyanna's father, Set the Warden of the North, was summoned to court to answer for his son. Aerys told Rickard that he could have a trial by combat to determine his son's innocence. he chose fire as his champion. Lord Rickard was suspended in the throne room in his armor and slowly roasted alive over a flame. Brandon, chained nearby in a device that tightened a strangling cord around his own neck every time he moved, watched his father die and tried to reach a sword just out of his grasp, and strangled himself in the attempt. Two Starks, the Lord of Winterfell and his heir, murdered in the throne room of King's Landing while petitioning for justice. Then, Aerys sent ravens to the Eyrie, demanding that Lord Jon Arryn hand over his wards, Eddard Stark, brother of the man the king had just killed, and Robert Baratheon, betrothed to the woman who had apparently been taken by the king's son. Jon Arryn, 70 years old, a man who had spent his entire life in faithful service to the Targaryen crown, looked at this demand and made a decision. He would not hand them over. He would instead raise his banners. Robert's rebellion had begun. Not with Robert swearing vengeance for his love, though that was certainly part of it. It began with an old man deciding that there were limits, and that those limits had been reached. Section 5. The Warrior God. Robert's campaign in the rebellion. If you want to understand what Robert Baratheon was at his absolute peak, what the Demon of the Trident actually looked like in practice, you need to follow him through the campaign of his rebellion. Because the military history of this war, often glossed over in favor of the dramatic scenes it produced, is a genuinely extraordinary piece of generalship and personal courage. Robert did not merely win a rebellion. He won it the hard way, through a series of battles that should, by conventional military logic, have been either more cautious or more quickly finished. He won it his way, by moving fast, hitting hard, and trusting that the momentum he generated could be sustained. The rebellion technically started in the Vale, with Jon Arryn raising his banners, but it was Robert who became its face and its force. He was 20 years old, newly returned from the Eyrie to Storm's End, freshly sworn in as a rebel against the Iron Throne, and he moved with a speed and decisiveness that astonished everyone watching. His first challenge was his own backyard. Not all of the Lords of the Stormlands rallied to Robert immediately. Some remained loyal to the crown. Lords Grandison, Caffrey, and Fell, three powerful Stormlord houses, planned to join forces at the old Targaryen castle of Summerhall and then march on Storm's End to put the rebellion down before it could properly begin. They planned to unite their armies before moving. It was a sound strategy. Robert hit them before they could unite. He moved so fast that he arrived at Summerhall before the three armies could converge. He fought 3 separate battles in a single day, 3 separate battles against 3 separate armies, and he won all 3 of them. He killed Lord Fell in personal combat. He captured the Loyalist commanders, and rather than throwing them in dungeons or executing them, he treated them with such generous magnanimity, feasting them, honoring their courage, letting them keep their dignity, that most of them pledged their loyalty to him on the spot. This was Robert at his best, the soldier who wins and then converts his enemies into allies through sheer personal warmth. Stannis, famously, was furious about this. He wrote to his brother that these men would have handed Robert over to Aerys without a second thought if they had won, and that treating them as honored guests was dangerously naive. Robert probably knew Stannis was right. He did it anyway, because it was also true that it worked. Summerhall secured his position in the Stormlands, but the war was not going to be won there. He needed to link up with Jon Arryn's forces from the Vale and Eddard Stark's from the north. To do that, he needed to move west and north, which meant marching through territory that was not reliably friendly. He advanced toward Ashford in the Reach. This was his one significant defeat of the entire war. At Ashford, the vanguard of the Tyrell army, commanded not by Lord Mace Tyrell himself, who arrived late, but by his formidable bannerman Randyll Tarly, engaged Robert's forces and drove them back. Tarly was a gifted commander, arguably the best purely tactical mind in Westeros, and he was not a man who made easy mistakes. It is notable that Randyll Tarly is the only man who ever defeated Robert in a battle, a distinction that Jaime Lannister later mentioned, with genuine respect, calling him the only person who had done what even Rhaegar could not. Robert retreated north through the Riverlands, wounded and pursued. His situation looked bad. He was cut off from his allies, running short on support, and a powerful loyalist army was on his heels. He took shelter in a town called Stony Sept, and here, in Stony Sept, something happened that encapsulates everything that was remarkable about Robert Baratheon as a symbol and a leader. Lord John Connington, the Hand of the King and the commander of the Loyalist pursuit, occupied the town and began searching it house by house for Robert. Connington had him, or should have. Robert was somewhere in Stony Sept, wounded and without an army. If Connington had simply burned the town, Robert would have had nowhere to go. This is actually what Sir Miles Toyne of the Golden Company later told Connington directly. Tywin Lannister would have burned it. Robert would have died. The rebellion would have ended. Yes, Connington did not burn the town. He was too concerned about his own glory. He wanted the credit of personally killing or capturing Robert, and too concerned about the optics of massacring civilian subjects of the crown. While he searched, the ordinary people of Stony Sept hid Robert. They moved him from house to house, from cellar to attic, staying one step ahead of the soldiers. The Septons of the town rang their bells as warning. The people of the Riverlands, who had little love for Aerys or his increasingly erratic rule, protected a rebel lord they had never met, because something about him had already inspired that kind of loyalty. When Eddard Stark and Hoster Tully's combined forces arrived and attacked, Robert burst out of hiding and joined the battle. The Battle of the Bells went to the rebels. The loyalists fled. And Robert Baratheon, who had been a hunted fugitive in a borrowed cellar, emerged from Stony Sept as the undisputed leader of a combined rebel army with the momentum of victory behind it. Connington later recalled that the sound of those bells would haunt him for the rest of his life, the sound of the moment he failed and Robert survived. After Stony Sept, the geography of the war shifted decisively. The rebels consolidated north of the Trident. Eddard Stark took a wife, Lord Hoster Tully's daughter Catelyn, though she had originally been intended for Brandon Stark before his murder. Jon Arryn married Lysa Tully, her sister. Robert attended both weddings at Riverrun, enjoying himself with the generous, uncomplicated pleasure that was one of his genuinely appealing qualities. He was also, around this time, formally declaring his claim to the Iron Throne, something that required some legal scaffolding, which the Maesters provided in the form of his Targaryen blood. Robert's paternal grandmother had been Princess Rhaelle Targaryen, the youngest daughter of King Aegon V, making Robert the distant cousin of Rhaegar, Viserys, and the unborn Daenerys. The Maesters used this connection to justify his claim. Robert, characteristically, would later say that his real claim was his warhammer. Everything was now pointing toward the Trident. Rhaegar Targaryen had finally emerged from wherever he had been during the preceding months, the Tower of Joy, where Lyanna was dying in childbed, and was marshalling the full remaining strength of the Targaryen cause. He gathered the armies of the Crownlands and secured 10,000 Dornish men under Prince Lewin Martell of the King's Guard, and led his forces north to the Crossing. On the rebel side, Robert commanded the combined hosts of the Baratheon Stormlands, the Stark North, the Arryn Vale, and the Tully Riverlands. Both sides knew this was the war's decisive moment. Whoever held the Trident would hold the kingdom. Section 6, the Trident. The moment that defined a life. The Ruby Ford. This is what they call it now, and the reason for the name is sitting in the bed of the Trident in the form of rubies that have never been recovered. The rubies from a dead prince's breastplate, scattered by the blow that ended a dynasty. The Battle of the Trident, fought in 283 AC, was one of the largest military engagements in the history of Westeros. On the Loyalist side, Rhaegar commanded roughly 40,000 men, fresh and unbloodied, with the weight of the Targaryen name and the memory of 300 years of absolute rule behind them. On the rebel side, Robert led a slightly smaller force that had seen more combat and was, as a result, considerably more experienced. They had been hammered and shaped by months of fighting. Rhaegar's army had been assembled quickly for this final confrontation and had not been tested. The battle itself was brutal and for a long time genuinely undecided. On Robert's left flank, the Dornish men under Prince Lewin Martell pushed hard, threatening to collapse the rebel position entirely. It was Sir Lyn Corbray, picking up his wounded father's Valyrian steel sword, Lady Forlorn, who led the charge that broke the Dornish, in killing the already wounded Prince Lewin in the process. On other parts of the field, Ser Barristan Selmy, fighting for Rhaegar, as his oaths required, cut through rebel knights like a man through tall grass, killing a dozen named warriors before eventually being wounded himself. Lord Jason Mallister slew 3 of Rhaegar's bannermen. The field was a chaos of personal heroism on both sides. And then, in the middle of all of it, in the shallows of the Ruby Ford where the water ran cold and brown and churned up by the hooves of thousands of war horses, two men found each other. Rhaegar Targaryen was armored all in black. On his breastplate, a three-headed dragon was worked entirely in rubies, and they caught the sunlight and threw it back in points of red fire with every breath he drew. He was, by every account, exactly what a prince should look like: noble, composed, carrying himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had made his peace with whatever was about to happen. Jorah Mormont would say it best, years later, speaking to Rhaegar's daughter: Rhaegar fought valiantly, Rhaegar fought nobly, and Rhaegar died. Robert Baratheon arrived in this moment in a different register entirely. He was rage and forward motion made physical. He wore his great antlered helm. He carried his hammer. The battle was screaming around him, and he was in the middle of it, and there was only one thing in the whole burning world that he wanted to reach: the man who had taken Lyanna, the man who had turned his life inside out, the man he had been dreaming of killing for years. They clashed in the current. Two mounted knights sat circling and striking in water up to their horses' knees, surrounded by a battle that had been waiting for this moment to know what it meant. Rhaegar managed to wound Robert. This is confirmed. Robert did not escape unhurt, but he could not deliver the finishing blow. And Robert, with the fearlessness that was his single most consistent quality, needed only one opening. When it came, he took it. The blow from Robert's warhammer stove in the dragon on Rhaegar's breastplate and the chest beneath it. The rubies scattered. They flew in every direction and fell into the current, and the river ran red for a moment. And Rhaegar Targaryen, crown prince of the Seven Kingdoms, husband of Elia Martell, secret husband of Lyanna Stark, father of a secret son who would one day be everything, died in the shallows of the Trident. Yet the loyalist army broke. Without Rhaegar, there was no cause to die for. They ran or they surrendered, and Robert Baratheon stood in the water, with blood on his armor and his enemy dead at his feet. And he had won. He had actually won. The Targaryen dynasty was not dead yet. Aerys still lived, King's Landing still stood, and 1,000 other things still needed doing. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The war was over. Robert had done what he set out to do. When Eddard Stark arrived on the scene a short time later, his friend had been too wounded to ride at full speed. He found Rhaegar already dead in the stream. He saw men of both armies scrambling through the water around the corpse, searching for the rubies. And he looked at Robert, and he understood that his friend had just changed the history of the world. He also understood, though he would not know the full truth for several more days, that it had not brought Lyanna back, and that it never would. What happened next moved with the speed of catastrophe. News of Rhaegar's death reached King's Landing, and Aerys, finally, too late, grasping that the rebellion was not going to be crushed, sent his pregnant queen Rhaella and Prince Viserys away to Dragonstone. He kept Elia Martell and her children as hostages against Dorne, a decision that would have appalling consequences. He prepared his wildfire, hundreds of caches of the green alchemical fire buried throughout the city, enough to burn King's Landing to ash. And he waited for the rebels to arrive. Lord Tywin Lannister arrived first, the great lion of Casterly Rock, who had been waiting to see which side would win before committing, and offered his army and his loyalty to whoever controlled the city. Pycelle, the Grand Maester, convinced Aerys to open the gates, telling him Tywin was coming to defend the throne. Tywin came in and sacked the city. Ser Gregor Clegane killed Elia Martell and her children. Little Rhaenys, dragged from under her father's bed and stabbed so many times the number is almost unbelievable, and infant Aegon, whose skull was broken against a wall while his mother was forced to watch. Jaime Lannister killed Aerys to prevent the wildfire plot from consuming the entire city, becoming Kingslayer in the process. Robert arrived to find it already done. He stood before the bodies of Elia and the children, brought to him by Tywin as proof of loyalty. And he looked at them, and here is where Robert Baratheon's character fractures in a way that never fully healed. He said nothing. He was pleased they were dead. This is not subtle or ambiguous. The records are clear. He was pleased that the Targaryen children were gone, because he genuinely, viscerally hated everything that carried Targaryen blood. Eddard Stark, arriving and seeing the same bodies, called it murder. The two friends had the most serious argument of their relationship over this. Ned rode away in fury. That argument, that fracture over what Robert was willing to accept in his name, foreshadows almost everything that follows in their years in King's Landing. Ned's horror at what the Lannisters had done in Robert's service was not merely squeamishness. It was the beginning of his understanding that Robert was not going to hold the throne the way Ned needed him to hold it, that the cause they had fought for was going to produce a king who was not equal to it. And then Ned rode south to the Tower of Joy, where Lyanna was dying. She had given birth to a child who was not Robert's. She made Ned promise to protect the boy. She died with roses in her hands, and Robert never knew any of it. He was already in King's Landing, already being called king, already beginning the process of becoming someone else entirely. Eddard came home with a bastard son named Jon. Robert never asked too many questions about it, because Ned was his best friend, and because there were things Robert was very good at not seeing when he chose not to look. Section 7. Winning the crown he never wanted. The aftermath of war. The war had been won. The Targaryens, with a few exceptions, were either dead or in exile. Robert Baratheon was the undisputed master of the Seven Kingdoms. He was 21 years old, and for the first time since the rebellion began, he had nothing to move toward. No battle to plan, no army to lead, no enemy to face. Just the Iron Throne and everything it required. He looked at it and felt something that was probably close to despair. The coronation happened. The ceremonies were conducted. The oaths were sworn. The lords bent the knee. Robert became King Robert I, first of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, Protector of the Realm. He also became, it's in the view of those who had supported the Targaryens, and there were many, particularly in Dorne, where the memories of Elia and her children were fresh and raw and very angry, the usurper. He took those titles with the same directness he had always carried. He made practical decisions in rapid succession, the kind of decisions that a new king must make to consolidate power and signal the character of his reign. He removed the skulls of the Targaryen dragons from the throne room, those great yellowed things that had hung there for generations as symbols of Targaryen power, and replaced them with banners depicting hunts and battles. He was making a point. The age of dragons was over. This was the age of men, Baratheon men, and they hunted real prey with real weapons. He replaced the old symbols with new ones, and he extended mercy to his former enemies, including the remarkable decision to pardon Ser Barristan Selmy, who had fought brilliantly and loyally for the Targaryen cause, killing a dozen rebel knights at the Trident before being wounded nearly to death, and to keep him in the Kingsguard. Roose Bolton and others counseled killing him. Robert refused. Men who fought loyally for their cause deserved to live, even if their cause was the wrong one. This generosity was genuine, and it was one of Robert's better qualities. Ser Barristan served him faithfully for years. He also made a decision that would shadow everything that followed for the next 15 years. He listened to Jon Arryn and married Cersei Lannister. Robert had no desire to marry after Lyanna's death. He said this directly, more than once. Yet Jon Arryn told him that the realm needed an heir, that the Lannister alliance was essential to stability, that Cersei was beautiful and Tywin was rich and loyal and necessary. Robert eventually agreed, with the resigned practicality of a man doing what he knows has to be done rather than what he wants. The wedding took place in 284 AC at the Great Sept of Baelor, and it was genuinely magnificent. Thousands cheered. The city celebrated. Lord Tywin watched with the satisfaction of a man who had achieved the match he wanted. Cersei arrived at the altar young and golden and genuinely beautiful, and she was, by her own later admission, initially infatuated with the handsome, powerful man she was marrying. The wedding night destroyed it. Robert was drunk. This was not unusual at weddings, or indeed at any occasion where wine was present, and when he and Cersei were finally alone together, he whispered a name in the dark. Not her name, Lyanna. He called his new queen by the name of his dead betrothed. Cersei would remember this for the rest of her life. She told Eddard Stark about it years later, when confronted about her affair with Jaime. He was on top of me, in me, stinking of wine, and he whispered Lyanna. She did not say it as a wound exactly. She said it as a statement of fact. This is what the marriage was from the very first night. A ghost lived in their bed. There was no room for her in it. Robert distributed the assets of his victory with the characteristic generosity, careless in many ways, that would define his reign. He gave Storm's End to his youngest brother Renly, the affable and charming little brother who had been barely a teenager during the rebellion. He gave Dragonstone, the old Targaryen island fortress in the Narrow Sea, to Stannis, an act that both Robert and most observers interpreted as an honor, since Dragonstone had traditionally been the seat of the heir to the throne, and Robert was at this point childless and Stannis was his heir. Stannis received it as a slight. He had wanted Storm's End, the family seat, and he had spent the entire rebellion trapped in its walls enduring a year-long siege, while Robert won victories and fame elsewhere. The two brothers never fully resolved this. Stannis carried the resentment of it for the rest of his life. The realm settled, more or less. Yet Jon Arryn went to Dorne after the war and negotiated a peace with the furious Martells, a peace that was cold and hollow and built on silence about what had been done to Elia and her children, but a peace nonetheless. The Iron Islands needed dealing with. Balon Greyjoy, always looking for opportunity, launched a rebellion of his own 6 years into Robert's reign, and Robert crushed it with the same decisive force he had applied to everything else, emerging victorious in less than a year. He hosted a great tournament for Joffrey's name day. He went on hunts. He attended tournaments. He ate and drank with genuine enthusiasm. He did not, in any meaningful way, govern. Section 8. The King Who Hated Being King. Robert on the Iron Throne. Jon Arryn ran the realm. This is not really a contested point. While Robert was the king, he was nominally in charge, was the origin of all authority and the face on the coin. The actual daily functioning of the Seven Kingdoms, for most of his 17-year reign, was managed by his hand, the same Jon Arryn who had raised him and started the rebellion for him. Arryn sat in the small council meetings. Arryn reviewed the petitions. Arryn managed the relationships with the great lords, balanced the budgets, adjudicated the disputes that kept arriving from every corner of a very large kingdom. Robert would occasionally attend small council meetings, and Tywin Lannister, in an acid observation to his grandson Tommen years later, noted that over 17 years of rule, Robert had attended exactly 3 such meetings. 3 in 17 years. What did he do with the rest of the time? Broadly speaking, he ate, he drank, he hunted. Yet he went to tournaments. He fathered bastards. A remarkable number of bastards, scattered across every social class and every region of the kingdom. The exact number known only to the gods and Varys, who kept meticulous records of such things. He engaged in the pleasures that had always been his, expanded to the scale that absolute power makes available. He was the king. Nobody told him no. The physical transformation of Robert Baratheon over these 17 years is one of the most dramatic in the lore. The young man who had stood in the Trident and killed Rhaegar Targaryen had been described as muscled, like a maiden's fantasy, clean-shaven, powerful without being heavy. The Robert Baratheon who rode to Winterfell at the start of Game of Thrones had gained at least 8 stone, that is roughly 50 kilograms, had roughly 115 pounds, and wore it everywhere. His face was perpetually red. His eyes had dark circles beneath them that spoke of too many late nights and too much wine. His beard was a great wild thing that he wore partly, it seemed, to conceal the double chin beneath it. He sweated through his clothes when he walked. He appeared, to observers, to be perpetually half-drunk even at the best of times. He was also still capable, in brief moments, of glimpsing the person he had been. There is a scene in the first season of the show, and its equivalent in the books, where Robert, slightly drunk and deeply nostalgic, sits with Eddard and starts talking about the war, about the fights, about the men they killed and the men they lost, about what it felt like when everything was real and clear and you knew exactly who you were. In those moments, you can see the ghost of the demon of the Trident still moving behind the eyes of the Fat King, and it is one of the most affecting things in the entire story. He had not forgotten who he was, he just couldn't reach it anymore. The Iron Throne contributed to this in ways that George R.R. Martin clearly intended as a commentary on power itself. The Iron Throne, a seat literally made from the swords of enemies, forged by dragonfire, notoriously uncomfortable, with edges that had cut several kings who sat on it carelessly, was not merely a chair. It was a symbol of the impossible position of absolute rule. It was beautiful and terrible, and it hurt everyone who sat on it. Robert hated it the same way you can hate something you have conquered and cannot escape. He had won the throne. He had paid for it with everything he had, and now it was his, and it required things of him that he fundamentally could not give. He was, at his core, a soldier and a companion. He thrived in simplicity. The clean clarity of physical conflict, the uncomplicated warmth of good company, the satisfaction of a hunt or a feast, or a bawdy story well told. The governance of a kingdom offered none of these things. It offered complexity, nuance, the management of competing egos, the navigation of delicate political calculations, the patient accumulation of small advantages over long stretches of time. These were skills Robert did not possess and, crucially, did not want to develop. He also carried, through all of this, the permanent, unhealing wound of Lyanna. It is impossible to properly assess Robert Baratheon without fully reckoning with what her death meant to him. This was not simply the grief of losing a betrothed. It was the loss of the future he had been building toward, the future where he won the war and got the girl, and Ned was his brother and everything made sense. Lyanna was the point of the rebellion, not in the political sense, but in the personal sense. He had not really been fighting for a throne or an abstract principle of justice. He had been fighting for her, and she was dead before he even got to King's Landing. He had won everything and gotten nothing, and that void, that hollow at the center of his victory, he filled with wine and meat and the bodies of women who were not her. There is a remarkable conversation in the show between Robert and Cersei, in their shared bedchamber, where they speak to each other with a surprising and terrible honesty about their marriage. Robert admits he cannot remember Lyanna's face anymore. It has been so long that the specific details have blurred. He says this with a kind of quiet devastation that is the most unguarded we ever see him. Cersei, for her part, admits she had loved him at the start, really loved him, before the weight of all of it ground whatever warmth she had been capable of into something harder and colder. They sit in that room and they look at each other, and they both understand that they have made each other deeply unhappy and that there is nothing to be done about it. Their relationship was also, intermittently, physically violent. Robert hit Cersei. The text is not subtle about this. This is not a hidden or ambiguous aspect of who he was. The same recklessness that made him magnificent in battle expressed itself in his marriage as something much uglier. He had no patience for being crossed, no tolerance for the kind of sophisticated opposition that Cersei represented, and he responded to provocation with his hands. He was not a good husband. He was not even a decent one. Cersei's choices, the affair with Jaime, the decision to produce Lannister children and pass them off as his, were responses to a situation of genuine misery that Robert created and sustained. The children, Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen, were not his. This he never knew. He spent his reign believing he was the father of 3 true-born heirs, never noticing the thing that Eddard Stark eventually noticed, that every Baratheon in history, going back centuries, had black hair and blue eyes, that the law of genetics, if you accept the observation as Ned did, said that if Robert had fathered Cersei's children, they would have those features. And none of Cersei's children had them. They were all gold-haired, Lannister gold. The secret was sitting in plain sight for 15 years, and nobody looked at it directly because everyone with eyes to see had reasons to look away. Robert was also, during his reign, involved in an ongoing argument with himself about the Targaryens. The survivors, Viserys and Daenerys, children of Aerys and Rhaella, living in exile across the narrow sea, represented a theoretical threat to his throne, and his response to that threat oscillated between paranoid fury and a slightly shamefaced awareness that killing children was something he had already permitted once and should probably not be eager to do again. When Daenerys married Khal Drogo and became pregnant, Robert convened his small council and insisted on sending assassins. Eddard refused to be part of it and resigned as Hand. Robert reinstated him. And yet the assassins went anyway, because Robert ultimately could not talk himself out of the fear that a live Targaryen claimant was an existential danger to everything he had built. He was right to worry, in the abstract political sense. He was wrong in the personal sense, the moral sense, and he knew it a little. On his deathbed, he told Eddard to strike from his will the order to kill Daenerys, yet saying the gods were punishing him for the order. Dying men often find a clarity that living ones resist. Robert found it late, but he found it. Section 9, The Fat King, Decline, Drinking, and the Death of a Dream. The man who arrived at Winterfell at the beginning of Game of Thrones was not the man who had been at the Trident. He was the wreckage of that man, surrounded by the evidence of how the years had consumed him. And yet, there was something still there, something still alive in the wreckage, that made you feel the tragedy of it, rather than simply the disgust. He was 35 years old. not an ancient man, not even truly old, but the body of a man who had spent 15 years in extraordinary excess looked much older than 35. He was obese and red-faced and perpetually damp with his own sweat. He leaned on attendants walking upstairs. His armor, the armor crafted in the glory days when he was a physical god, no longer fit him, and there is a famous scene where his squire, young Lancel Lannister, has to gently inform him of this fact while trying to help him dress. The old armor needs to be let out. There is a terrible comedy in it, and beneath the comedy, a kind of sadness that doesn't announce itself but is present throughout. The visit to Winterfell has a specific purpose. Jon Arryn is dead, poisoned, though Robert does not know this yet, and Robert needs a new hand. He comes north to ask Eddard Stark, the truest friend he has ever had, to leave his home and his family and come to King's Landing to do what Jon Arryn did. There is something almost boyish in the way Robert makes this request. Not just a political necessity, though it is certainly that. There is a genuine longing underneath it. Come south, be near me, be my friend again. The friendship between the two men, which was forged at the Eyrie and tested at the Trident and strained by the years of distance, is still the realest thing Robert has. More real than his marriage, more real than his kingship, more real than anything in the Red Keep. The first thing he does when he arrives at Winterfell is go to the crypts. He insists on it before anything else. Eddard takes him down into the cool stone beneath the castle, past the statues of the old kings of the north, to the place where Lyanna Stark is interred. Robert stands before her statue and looks at her stone face and says the sculptor failed to do her justice. He holds a blue winter rose, the flower she loved, as to the flower Rhaegar had placed in her lap at Harrenhal, and he grieves. Openly, without embarrassment, without the pretense that 15 years of marriage and fatherhood have reduced the loss to something manageable. Eddard watches him and doesn't know which of them he pities more. The visit to Winterfell also produces a betrothal. Robert proposes to marry young Joffrey to Sansa Stark, Ned's eldest daughter. It is, on its face, a political arrangement. But read through the lens of what we now know about Robert's emotional landscape, it is also something else. One more attempt to complete the connection to the Starks that Lyanna's death prevented. If he couldn't marry into the family himself, his son would. The Baratheons and Starks would be joined, and his friendship with Ned would be secured by blood. It is bitterly ironic that the betrothal he proposes will ultimately contribute to everything going catastrophically wrong. But Robert does not see the chains of consequence stretching forward from this moment. He sees a son, a girl, a union, a completion. The Robert we follow through the first season of the show is a man who is not looking at the ground in front of him. He is looking backward, at the Trident, and before it, at a younger world where things were physical and clear. He tells old war stories with genuine joy. He drinks with the unstinting commitment of someone who has found, in drink, the only reliable way to stop thinking. He competes with the old fighters, wants to enter the melee at Joffrey's name day tournament, and has to be talked out of it by Eddard. Who knows that a 40-year-old obese king entering a melee is a different proposition from the 20-year-old terror who once cleared fields of men. He hunts. Hunting is his real religion by this point. The forest is the one place where the king's life still has some overlap with the warrior's life. You are physical in the forest. You are attentive, alert, outdoors. There is something to chase and something to kill, and the hierarchy of court and council is temporarily absent. Robert in the forest is closer to Robert on the battlefield than Robert on the throne ever could be. His relationship with his children, or rather the children he believes are his, is largely one of benign neglect laced with occasional contempt. He was never present for their births. Whenever Cersei went into labor, Robert would conveniently be on a hunt. He knows Joffrey is trouble. He admits this directly to Eddard, expressing genuine worry that his heir is not what he should be. But he does not act on this knowledge in any consistent way. He does not father Joffrey in any meaningful sense of the word. He is present in the castle and absent in every way that matters. His bastards are another story. He acknowledges some of them, sends gifts, but largely they exist in the same peripheral space as everything else he has sired, without thinking too hard about it. The one who will matter most, Gendry, the blacksmith's apprentice, hidden in plain sight in King's Landing, with his black hair and his blue eyes and his strong hands, is noticed by Eddard during his investigations, but never by Robert. The son who is most genuinely his It carrying the Baratheon looks so strongly that the resemblance would have been unmistakable, grows up 30 feet from the Red Keep and is never acknowledged. The crown is in debt. This is not a minor footnote. By the time of Game of Thrones, the crown owes roughly 6 million gold dragons, 3 million to the Lannisters. The rest spread across other sources. The treasury that had been left to Robert, not a rich treasury but a functional one, has been depleted by 17 years of tournaments and feasts and generous gifts and the straightforward reality that Robert spent money the way he swung his hammer, with force and without calculation. He had no instinct for financial restraint. He had no instinct for any kind of restraint. The realm was not bankrupt yet, but it was heading there, and nobody with actual power was doing anything about it. The small council around him, in these final years, was not helping. Petyr Baelish, Littlefinger, was master of coin and actively using his position to create conditions that served his own interests rather than the realm's. Grand Maester Pycelle was compromised in ways that would not become fully apparent for some time. Varys the Spider gathered information with a dispassion that served the realm in theory, but served unclear interests in practice. These were not men whose first loyalty was to Robert. They were men orbiting a king who had largely left the seat of power empty, filling the space his absence created with their own agendas. Robert Baratheon, in his final years, was a man being governed by the court around him rather than governing it. He had taken himself out of the equation, and the equation had proceeded without him. And then Jon Arryn died, and Robert came north. And Ned Stark, who was everything Robert was not, careful, attentive, principled to the point of self-destruction, started looking at the people around Robert and seeing things that Robert had refused to look at for 15 years. Section 10, The Boar Hunt, How a King Dies. Eddard Stark, as Hand of the King, uncovered the truth about Cersei's children. He found the pattern in the genealogy records. Black hair, blue eyes, back through centuries of Baratheon history, right up to Joffrey and his siblings, who were blonde. He found Gendry. He found young Bara, an infant in a brothel, daughter of a prostitute, with black hair and her father's blue eyes. He understood what it meant. Yet he went to Cersei and told her what he knew, and he gave her a chance to flee, to take her children and go, before he told Robert. He did this because he knew Robert. He knew that Robert's reaction to learning that his 3 children were the product of incest between his wife and her twin brother would be instantaneous, volcanic, and potentially fatal for everyone involved. He did not want the children to die for their mother's choices. He warned her. Cersei did not flee. She played the game as she always had, aggressively, from a position of Lannister wealth and family solidarity, and with a willingness to destroy whatever got in her way. She gave instructions to her cousin Lancel, who had been assigned as Robert's personal squire, about what to bring the king when he went hunting. The hunt was already planned. Robert was in the Kingswood south of King's Landing, riding with Renly and Lancel and Barristan and a group of nobles and companions, hunting for a white hart that he never found. The white hart found by others while he was still searching. Disappointed, he heard instead about a monstrous boar reported deeper in the forest. A boar of unusual size and ferocity, the kind of quarry that would give a king real sport. Lancel kept his wineskin full, but not with the wine Robert was used to. Cersei had instructed her cousin to bring strong wine, the same sour red Robert always drank, but fortified, 3 times more potent than what he was used to. Robert drank the first skin and asked for another. Lancel fetched it, as a squire does. Robert drank that too. The conversation grew loose and nostalgic. Renly, bored and uncomfortable, eventually left to return to the castle. Robert barely noticed. He found the boar, or the boar found him. He sent his guards back. He wanted to face it himself, alone, as a king should face great prey. This was not bravado for an audience. This was Robert being Robert, direct, physical, unafraid, reducing the world to its simplest possible form. Him and the boar and the outcome. But he was also, by this point, profoundly drunk. The strong wine had done its work. His reflexes were slower than they should have been. His judgment, never his strongest quality, was further compromised. He had faced wild boars before, but wild boars are not to be taken lightly under any circumstances. They are fast, they are armored in their own dense muscle and thick hide, and they charge with a determination and force that has surprised better men than Robert Baratheon. The king wounded the boar, he got his spear in, but the animal charged again before he could finish it, and the tusk caught him in the belly, below his armor, and tore him open. He killed the boar. Of this there was no doubt. He killed it, but the wound in his gut was mortal. The internal injuries, in a world without surgery, without antibiotics, without anything but clean linen and the prayers of maesters, were a death sentence. He was carried back to King's Landing on a litter, and the city understood what was happening before the gates had even closed behind him. Eddard came to him as he was dying. He found Robert semi-lucid, in enormous pain. So he trying to hold himself together through the same force of will that had gotten him through the Trident. He asked Ned to write his will. He was naming Ned as protector of the realm until his son Joffrey came of age. He dictated it, and Ned wrote it, and he changed the wording slightly. Not Joffrey specifically, but the rightful heir. It was a small modification, and Robert accepted it without pressing. He was too weak to press, and in the fog of pain and milk of the poppy, perhaps the distinction seemed minor. He sent his love to Lyanna through Eddard. Even dying, even in those final hours, she was there. The first thought and the last. He also told Eddard to strike the order to kill Daenerys from his will. He had gone too far, he said. The gods were punishing him for it. He had been, he admitted, a wretched king, bad as Aerys. He died without knowing the truth of his children. He died without knowing that Lyanna had gone willingly to Rhaegar. He died without knowing that his best friend had been carrying a secret for 17 years that changed everything. He died as he had lived, with the largest possible story he could tell himself about his life still basically intact, still believing in the version of events that cast him as the wronged man who had avenged the woman he loved and taken what was his by right of conquest. His funeral feast featured roast boar. Cersei ate it with enthusiasm. She told Tyrion it tasted like triumph. Lancel Lannister would carry the guilt of his role in Robert's death for the rest of his life, eventually joining the faith militant and confessing his sins to the High Sparrow. He called himself a Kingslayer. A different kind of Kingslayer from Jaime, one who did it not with a sword, but with a wineskin and a weaker wine at the wrong moment. Section 11, Legacy. What Robert left behind and what it cost the realm. Robert Baratheon left behind a throne, 3 children who were not his, a mountain of debt, a small council full of self-interested schemers, a marriage built on a ghost, and the seeds of everything that followed for the rest of Game of Thrones. The War of the Five Kings, that catastrophic realm-consuming civil conflict, was, in almost every meaningful sense, Robert's fault. Not because he was malicious, because he was absent, because he ran a kingdom the way a man runs from something he cannot face, and the things that grew in his absence were the things that destroyed the world he had built. Let us lay this out clearly, because the connections are real and instructive. Robert created the conditions for the War of the Five Kings in several specific ways. He left the treasury empty. 6 million gold dragons in debt, half of it to the Lannisters, meant that whoever held the throne after him was immediately in a position of dependence on the wealthiest family in the realm. This gave the Lannisters leverage over the crown that was not merely financial, but existential. It made Cersei's maneuvers after Robert's death considerably easier than they would have been if the crown had money of its own. He appointed Littlefinger as Master of Coin, and then never supervised him. Peter Baelish spent years using his position to enrich himself, and to create financial dependencies across the realm that served his own agenda. Robert either didn't know or didn't care, and either possibility is damning. He allowed Joffrey to grow up without meaningful parental involvement or consistent discipline. He knew, privately, that his heir was problematic. He did nothing about it in any sustained way. The Joffrey who took the throne after Robert's death, sadistic, impulsive, dangerous, utterly unsuited to power, was partly a product of Cersei's warping influence, but he was also partly a product of Robert's absence. If you are never present to correct your child, you cannot be surprised by what they become. He surrounded himself with the same people for 17 years and never asked whether they were actually serving the realm. Varys, Littlefinger, Pycelle, these were men with agendas that were not the realm's agenda, and Robert never looked at them with the critical eye of a king who understands that power attracts people who want to use it. He gave Stannis Dragonstone and then never properly addressed the wound it created. Stannis spent 17 years on a cold island, loyal but resentful, convinced he had been slighted. That resentment contributed directly to Stannis pressing his claim after Robert's death in a way that divided the realm and prolonged the war. A different resolution of the Storm's End question might have produced a different Stannis, not a warm one. Stannis was constitutionally incapable of warmth, but perhaps a less aggrieved one. He kept Ned Stark in the north for most of his reign, only summoning him south when things were already falling apart. The best person he knew, the one person whose judgment and integrity might have provided a useful counterweight to the corruption around him, was left on the other side of the kingdom because Robert couldn't quite bring himself to have Ned near him every day, watching him and seeing the king he wasn't. And yet, Robert Baratheon was also, genuinely, one of the great soldiers in the history of Westeros. He fought a rebellion, won it, and imposed a peace that lasted 17 years. Not a triumphant peace, not a glorious one, but a functioning one. No major wars during his reign except the Greyjoy Rebellion, which he crushed efficiently. No famines, no plagues, no catastrophes. The realm, for all its dysfunction, was fed and alive, and basically at peace. Compared to what came after him, the War of the Five Kings, with its hundreds of thousands dead, its burnt fields and starving small folk and destroyed castles, Robert's reign looks, in retrospect, almost benign. He was also, in his personal relationships, capable of a genuine warmth that almost nobody else in the story manages. His friendship with Ned was real. His mercy to former enemies was real. His enjoyment of people, all kinds of people, across social classes, was real. He was the kind of man who laughed easily and meant it, who made jokes and expected others to make jokes back, who had no patience for false solemnity or performative dignity. The feasts he loved were loud and crowded because he liked them that way, and he liked them that way because he genuinely enjoyed the company of other human beings in a way that was neither calculated nor cold. Yes, the tragedy of Robert Baratheon is that he was a great man who was assigned the wrong job. He was born into a world that needed a warrior, became one, and was then asked to be something entirely different. The skills that won him the throne were not the skills needed to hold it. The very qualities that made him magnificent in war, his impulsiveness, his directness, his willingness to charge in and deal with consequences later, made him disastrous in governance. He was Edward IV, as George R.R. Martin has confirmed, the brilliant Yorkist king who won the Wars of the Roses and then spent his second reign eating and drinking and wenching his way to an early death, leaving a succession crisis that swallowed everything he had built. The pattern is old and human and sad. But George R.R. Martin also gave Robert something that distinguishes him from a simple cautionary tale. He gave him the ability, in his final hours, to see himself clearly, not to deny what he was or what he had done, but to look at it and know it. Bad as Eris, he said, a wretched king. The gods are punishing me. This is not the self-serving blindness of a Cersei or a Tywin. It is the painful honesty of a man who can see the distance between what he meant to be and what he became, and who does not flinch from the measurement. Tyrion Lannister, who was not given to generosity about anyone, called Robert a great blustering oaf. Barristan Selmy, who served him faithfully, said he was a good knight but a bad king, and that he had no right to the throne he sat. Stannis, who loved him as much as Stannis was capable of loving anyone, said what my brother would do, and described him throwing himself into battle alone and breaking down castle gates with his bare hands. And there is in that description something that transcends mere military description. There is awe. There is the memory of being in the presence of something genuinely extraordinary. The Iron Throne chewed Robert up and spat out the fat king, but the demon was real, the warhammer was real, the trident was real. The moment in that ford, surrounded by bodies and cold water and the scattered rubies of a dying dynasty, was real. Nobody can take that from him. He just couldn't live there forever. The great mystery of Robert Baratheon, the question that haunts the character long after he is gone from the page and the screen, is whether anything could have saved him. So whether there was a version of the story in which the demon survived into the kingship. Some scholars of the story have argued that if Lyanna had lived, Robert might have been a different king, that her presence, her intelligence, her iron will might have provided the grounding he needed. Others point out that Robert was philandering before the betrothal, that his patterns were established early, and that Lyanna herself had no illusions about his capacity for faithfulness. Maybe the grief was the final push that broke something, or maybe the something was already broken, and the grief was just the first occasion for the breaking to show. What we know is this: The man who stands in the crypts of Winterfell, holding a blue winter rose and looking at a stone face that the sculptor failed to capture, is not a villain. He is not even, in that moment, a failure. He is a person in the middle of the oldest and most human experience there is, living in the aftermath of what you couldn't have, and trying to figure out what to do with the rest of your life. He got that part wrong. Most people do. Section 12. What Robert Baratheon means. The real lesson of the stag. Here, at the end of everything, it is worth asking what Robert Baratheon's story is actually about. Because George R.R. Martin does not write characters for simple consumption. Every person in this world is carrying something, pointing at something, meaning something beyond the surface level of their actions and their fates. Robert Baratheon is, at one level, a study in the difference between winning and ruling, between the kind of person who changes the world through force of will and physical supremacy, and the kind of person who maintains the world through patience, attention, and the quieted, unglamorous work of good governance. These are different skill sets. They occasionally appear in the same person. Tywin Lannister is the clearest example in the story of someone who combined both, but they are not naturally linked. The qualities that make a great conqueror, aggression, decisiveness, physical courage, magnetic charisma, are not the qualities that make a great administrator. History is full of men who won empires and couldn't run them. At another level, Robert is a meditation on grief and what we do with it. He loved Lyanna, lost her, and spent 15 years filling the hole with everything available: wine, food, women, hunts, tournaments, noise. He was not interested in healing. He was interested in distraction. The throne, and ironically, provided the perfect mechanism for this. It surrounded him with endless activity, endless demands on his attention, endless opportunities to be doing something other than sitting still and confronting what he had lost and what he had become. The greatest irony of Robert's kingship may be that the job he hated and performed so badly was, although in a dark way, the only thing keeping him functional. At the deepest level, Robert is a character about the mismatch between the story we are written for and the one we end up living. He was written, by the values of his world, for a story about war and glory. He got it, briefly, and it was everything the story promised. Blood and fire, and rubies in the river, and a dynasty ending at his feet. And then the story continued, and the continuation was something he had no script for. A throne. A marriage, a court, a peace. He couldn't improvise his way through this new story, and nobody around him had the capacity or the will to help him learn. The demon of the Trident and the Fat King were the same person. That's the whole point. That's what makes it a tragedy rather than a simple contrast between a great man and a lesser one. The qualities that produced the demon also produced the Fat King. The courage that charged Rhaegar at the Trident was the same quality, expressed differently, as the recklessness that charged the boar while drunk. The generosity that treated defeated enemies as honored guests was the same quality as the carelessness that trusted Littlefinger with the treasury and never asked questions. Yes, the warmth that made armies love him was the same warmth that couldn't survive 17 years in a cold marriage to a woman who hated him. He was not a hypocrite. He was not a fraud. He was a man who was entirely, authentically himself, in a role that had no space for what he authentically was. And the cost of that mismatch was paid by almost everyone who came after him. Robert Baratheon is inspired, George R.R. Martin has confirmed, by King Edward IV of England, a brilliant Yorkist warrior who won a civil war, took a throne, and then spent his second reign in excess and indulgence that contributed to the crisis his children could not survive. Robert also shares qualities with Henry VIII, the physical transformation, the squandered wealth, the magnetic force of personality that became oppressive in proximity. But Martin, as he always does, took historical material and made it into something richer and stranger. Robert is not a historical analogy. He is a fully realized person, with specific griefs and specific joys and a specific shape to his destruction that is entirely his own. What he leaves behind is a world in flames, the War of the Five Kings, the chaos that swallows Eddard Stark and Robb Stark and countless others who did not deserve the fate they received, the ascension of Joffrey, the long, ugly unraveling of everything Robert built. In one sense, this is his fault. In another, it is the fault of a world that makes warriors into kings and then wonders why the kingdom suffers. The Iron Throne was made to be uncomfortable. In the lore, it cuts the kings who sit on it. Some Meisters believe this is intentional. Aegon the Conqueror wanted his throne to remind the person on it that ruling is not supposed to be comfortable. Robert Baratheon, who famously hated the thing, who attended 3 small council meetings in 17 years of rule, who escaped the Red Keep every chance he got, was perhaps more honest than most about how the throne felt to him. He did not pretend to love it. He did not pretend to be good at it. He was the demon of the Trident. He was the Fat King. He was Robert of the House Baratheon, first of his name, king of the Andals and the First Men. And he lived and died exactly as he was, magnificent in the wrong ways, deficient in the necessary ones, genuinely loved by the people who knew him best, and responsible, in his absence as much as his presence, for the world that followed him. He is buried somewhere in King's Landing. The location is not specified in the text. The Ruby Ford still carries his name, in the sense that everyone who crosses that stretch of the Trident remembers what happened there. His bastards scatter across the realm, carrying his black hair and blue eyes into futures he never knew. His warhammer is presumably still at Storm's End, and the ghost of the demon occasionally flickers across the faces of the people who loved him, when they remember what he was before everything else. Tywin Lannister said he spent his time whoring and hunting and drinking until the last 2 killed him. He was not wrong, but he was also not entirely right. There was always something else happening underneath the feasting and the hunting and the wine. There was always, somewhere in the ruin, the man who stood on the walls of Storm's End and watched the sea take his parents and did not break. The man who sheltered in a cellar in Stony Sept and waited for his friends. The man who charged through a cold river toward a prince in black armor and did not flinch. He was great. He was ruinous. He was in the specific and complicated way that only truly human characters can be. Both of those things at the same time. Ours is the fury. His was. If you made it to the end of this journey through the complete life of Robert Baratheon, from the storms of Shipbreaker Bay to the woods of the Kingswood, from the Ruby Ford to the crypts of Winterfell, then I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me the time and place you are watching this from. Whether you are up at 2 in the morning somewhere in the north, or catching this in the afternoon sun, or watching between meetings from somewhere in the world, I would never guess. I genuinely want to know. Every one of those places and times is someone who decided this story was worth sitting with, and that means something. If this kind of deep, slow, atmospheric dive into the lore of Westeros is the kind of thing you want more of, and there is so much more to explore, so many more stories living in the corners of this world, then please give this video a like. It genuinely helps more people find this channel. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. We will be back with more of these, more worlds to unfold slowly in the dark, more figures who were magnificent and broken in equal measure. It's more questions about power and grief, and what it costs to be who you are in a world that asks you to be someone else. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams be kinder than Robert Baratheon's.